There are rooms that shouldn't exist. Rooms without doors, without records, without explanations. And sometimes they even have windows. But this one didn't face outside. It looked into another room. A room hidden for nearly 200 years. This is the story of why. Behind the walls. In the early 1820s, when New York City was still compact and unevenly developed, a narrow brick house was constructed on what would one day become the southern edge of Manhattan. At the time, this area sat close to the boundary between the city and what was still considered semi-rural land. Streets were quieter, buildings were fewer, and many homes were built with long-term practicality rather than visibility in mind. For nearly 2 centuries, the house remained standing as the city expanded, modernized, and slowly surrounded it. Owners changed, interiors were updated, utilities replaced, but the structure itself was never significantly altered. From the outside, it appeared unremarkable, just another old townhouse absorbed into a modern city. Nearly 200 years after it was built, the house was sold to a private buyer with an interest in historical preservation. Rather than gutting the interior, the new owner planned a careful restoration, one that would respect the original layout and materials while making the house livable by modern standards. As part of the restoration process, original architectural drawings were requested from city archives. These documents were meant to serve as a reference, a way to understand how the house was originally intended to function room by room. It was during this comparison between the drawings and the physical structure that something unusual was noticed. One room on the second floor did not behave the way it should have. Its proportions felt correct, its placement logical, yet something about it resisted explanation. According to the original plans, the room was designed with a window facing the exterior of the house. But standing inside it, surrounded by solid walls, it quickly became clear that no such window existed. Not now, and not at any point in recent memory. Instead of an exterior window, the room contained something far more unsettling. Set directly into one of the interior walls was a complete wooden window frame, aged, intact, and unmistakably original to the house's earliest years. The glass itself was uneven, slightly warped, typical of early 19th century production. It had not been replaced, it had not been removed, and behind it was not the outside world. Behind the glass was another room. Further investigation revealed that this inner room did not appear on any architectural drawing, property record, or renovation permit. It had no door, no visible access point, and no ventilation system connecting it to the rest of the house. Yet despite all of this, the room was not empty. Along one wall, several objects had been carefully placed, arranged with a level of intention that ruled out abandonment or coincidence. Everything inside suggested preparation, as if the room had been made ready for a purpose that was never fulfilled. Renovation began slowly, not with demolition but with careful removal of layers added over generations. Each wall was examined, each floorboard lifted by hand. The goal was preservation. not discovery. But old houses rarely respect intention. Beneath layers of plaster and paint, the house revealed its original structure: bricks, beams, construction methods no longer used. And then something didn't align. One interior wall was thicker than the rest, not by inches, but by feet. At first, it was assumed to be structural, a support wall. Nothing unusual, until the measurements were compared. Architects were consulted. Historical blueprints were reviewed. None of them showed a room in that location, but the wall remained, unexplained. It was then that a decision was made. Not to tear the wall down, but to open it carefully. No one expected what was waiting behind it. Not a storage space, not a crawl space, but a room with a window. The opening was made slowly, brick by brick, layer by layer. What stood behind the wall was not empty space. It was a room, fully enclosed, carefully constructed, and never meant to be found. The room was small, smaller than expected. No doors leading in, no visible reason for its existence, and yet it was finished. Plastered walls, a wooden floor, careful craftsmanship. Then there was the window, a full-sized window, set perfectly into the wall, glass intact, frame original, but from the outside, there was nothing. Standing inside the room, the window felt wrong. It allowed light in, but no view out, as if it was never meant to show anything, only to suggest normalcy. The room was not empty. Someone had prepared it. A wooden chair stood in the center, facing the wall. Not the window, the wall. On the floor nearby, several objects had been laid out, not randomly, purposefully. Old newspapers, more than 40 years old, carefully stacked, not discarded, as if they were meant to be read. Again, nothing in the room suggested storage. Nothing suggested abandonment. Everything suggested use. The objects inside the room were examined carefully. None of them appeared random. None of them appeared decorative. They were practical, specific, and deliberately chosen. The chair showed signs of long-term use. The legs were worn unevenly, the seat slightly polished by friction. This was not a chair placed for storage. Someone had sat here. Often. The newspapers were not chosen at random either. They all came from the same period, the same region, and many pages had been folded to the same sections: classifieds, obituaries, local notices. There were no personal items, no clothing, no photographs, nothing that would identify a single individual. It was a room designed for someone to be anonymous. The window raised even more questions. It allowed daylight to enter at precise hours. Morning, late afternoon, almost as if it was designed to regulate time, not view. Historical researchers were consulted. In the early 1800s, rooms like this were rare, but not unheard of, especially in cities, especially in houses owned by certain professions. Some were used for isolation, others for observation, Others still for activities that required silence and invisibility. There was no evidence of force, no locks on the inside, no restraints, no signs of confinement, which made the purpose of the room even harder to accept. Because whoever used this room may have entered it willingly and returned again. Records showed that the house was built in the early 1820s, at a time when New York was growing fast, but laws were still unevenly enforced. Privacy meant something different then. The original owner was listed as a private merchant, a respectable title, broad enough to mean many things. He dealt in imports, shipments, goods that arrived quietly and left the same way. In that era, hidden rooms served many purposes. Some were for storage, some for meetings, some for people who needed to remain unseen, especially in port cities. The window may have been the key, not for watching the outside world, but for knowing when it was safe. Light, time, silence. At some point, the room stopped being useful. Ownership changed, laws tightened. What was once practical became a liability, and so the room was sealed. Not destroyed, sealed. The decision was careful. No records mention the room, no blueprints include it, as if the safest way to erase it was to pretend it never existed. The house passed through generations. Owners came and went, renovations happened, walls were reinforced, but the room remained, waiting. Not because it was hidden perfectly, but because no one was looking for it. Yet something about the room resisted closure, not physically, psychologically. Architects who studied the plans noticed something unsettling. The room was not an addition. It was part of the original design, which raised a final question. If the room was planned from the beginning, who was it planned for? There were no records of disappearance linked to the house, no crimes, no scandals, which made the room even harder to place. Some experts suggested the most unsettling explanation, that the room was never meant for harm, but for waiting. Waiting for time to pass. Waiting for silence, waiting for the outside world to change. Because rooms like this were not unique. They existed in other houses, other cities, other centuries. Most were never found, not because they were better hidden, but because no one thought to look. Behind old walls, some rooms are not lost. They're just waiting. In other houses, behind other walls, rooms like this are still hidden.